right, everybody, welcome to Chapter 16, The Conquest of the Far West. This is going to be our last chapter for first semester. And basically what it's going to focus on are some of the things that we left off from Chapter 13. Because the last two chapters, of course, and 13 really are the Civil War and its aftermath and the build-up to it. What we're going to talk about here primarily is how we came to populate all that western land that we got as a result of the Mexican-American War and those other land acquisitions in the period of Manifest Destiny. So the time frame that we're kind of talking about in this chapter is roughly as far back as like the 1850s. So we'll say 1850 really to about 1890. Okay, so about 1850 to about 1890 is a time frame here. A lot of different stuff to talk about, but again, what the focus is on is really about how we acquired the lands in the West and how we went out and populated those areas to get them quickly enough for statehood, so on and so forth. Where we left off, you're talking about it's still a really good portion of that land in the West is not inhabited enough to make it to make it states. We're talking about the areas that become like Montana, the Dakotas, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Colorado, I think. So basically, all of the Great Plains region. All of that area is what we're talking about here. And again, so how do we get people out there? What brings them out there? And it's really a series of events that bring people out west. And it's really kind of like four separate areas. Today we'll talk about two of those areas, the mining and the Transcontinental Railroad. And then the other two we're going to be kind of talking about and we'll talk about ranching a little bit today too. And then the other one will deal with Indians, one part of this, and then the other one will deal with farming on the plains. So anyway, we'll go ahead and get right to it. So the first two things that really start to draw people out west are mining and cattle ranching. Okay. And we know about miners because we're talking about, that's how California became populated so quickly through after the gold rush after gold was discovered in California in 1849. And the regions quickly get populated with enough people to apply for statehood, and we start to fill up there quickly. So miners really start arriving here in the Americas, in the West rather, during the 1850s, okay? They come in droves. They come in big numbers, trying to strike it rich and find gold. Now the reality is that 95% of the miners that come out trying to strike it rich don't. They come out. By the time they get there, when you hear about there being a gold strike somewhere, the gold is gone. There's gold rushes all over the West in the 1850s and 60s. The most notable one, of course, is the California Gold Rush in 1849. That, of course, 1849, that's how the San Francisco 49ers get their name. A lot of sports teams in that region, if you're a sports fan, get their names. Their names derive from something that happened kind of during this era in the West. But there's a gold rush in Colorado in 1858. That's what gets Denver populated in that area and makes that like a big city, and eventually Colorado a state. There's one in Idaho in the 1860s, Montana a couple years after that. Ultimately, one in Alaska. The last big gold rush, the Yukon Gold Rush, was in Alaska right at the turn of the 20th century. So there's these big gold rushes all over the place, and people come over in droves, not just from other parts of the United States, but from foreign countries as well, which is something we'll talk about more here shortly. So the miners come in, they populate these regions, they become big enough for states. If you want to make money don't come here trying to find gold, strike a witch with gold. The people that made sustainable wealth largely are people that came over with supplies and things and opened up like a general store. They would open up a store. They would sell goods because many of the other miners and people would come over, would be ill prepared, and that was a great way to build wealth and sustain money. Some of the big stores that existed in the West Coast started off as general stores that catered to miners that came over looking to find gold. So we talked already about a lot of the mining booms that happened in different places. One of the most famous ones was something called the Comstock Lode that the AP talks about from time to time. The Comstock Lode is an interesting story. There was a guy by the name of Henry Comstock who overheard these two brothers talking about this big gold strike that they found. So Comstock had some papers drawn up saying that he owned the land where the gold was found. It was a fake. It were fake papers, but these brothers didn't know any better, and Comstock then claimed all the gold that they found, and I think he gave them like a small amount of money, like a pittance or something like that. But he has this one massive find, which was the largest single gold mine find that anybody had during the entirety of kind of this gold rush era. It amounted to, in today's dollars, about $400 million worth of gold and silver. It was found somewhere in Nevada. And even though wasn't the biggest gold rush, it was the biggest single take for one individual anywhere. And then, it's not very good with the coloring, but there's a piece of gold, silver ore from the Comstock Lode that's in the Smithsonian. So the thing about mining is, the city where these mines are found, they're known as boom towns because there's a gold boom and everybody runs to the town. When the gold is gone, everybody leaves and those boom towns become ghost towns, except for the ones that are a little more sustainable. An example would be a boom town, a place that started as a boom town and managed to kind of stick around. A couple examples would be a city like San Francisco, California, or Denver, Colorado. But for the most part, people would come, they'd see if they could find gold. If they can, great. If not, they'll leave. And once the gold is gone, everybody's gone. One of the other big things that draws people out west is also the cattle kingdom. Cattle ranching becomes a big deal really during the from 1850 to about 1875. This is largely because there was a new breed of cattle that came along that was known as the Texas Longhorn. University of Texas, that's how they get their name. This was a more durable animal. They could handle harsh weather conditions, which would often be dry in the cattle kingdom, which you're talking about like the Great Plains, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, places like that. This Texas Longhorn also, had a different or better tasting beef than other beef that was generally eaten by people out west. Now, today, if we ate Texas Longhorn beef, you wouldn't think it was all that great because technology and things like that have improved. The different beef they eat, like, Angus beef or Kobe beef or whatever it is. Those are like the really high-end ones now. But the Texas Longhorn becomes a huge, huge deal. And there's so much land out west, so people start raising cattle, and then you would send your cattle east to the meat packing plants where they'd be turned into food, and then you have plenty of beef and meat to feed, your high population areas along the east coast of the country. And that, of course, is aided also by railroads. Now, the cattle kingdom really has its roots in Mexico. Mexican laborers known as vaqueros, you have no idea what that looks like. Vaqueros. Vaqueros. So vaqueros Um, Basically like the Spanish version of a cowboy. And they kind of helped early on in bringing the Texas Longhorn and basically cattle in general to places in the United States, namely Texas, early on. This helps it to grow in the country. They had techniques of, using rope and lassoing and stuff that we kind of associate with Mexican cowboys. Uh, and it was it was a job that was first popularized by Mexican laborers, vaqueros. Uh, they created a new saddle, a Western saddle as it was called, that they would use, new spurs to use to kind of get your horses moving and stuff like that. So it has a lot of Mexican roots to it. Another thing that is attractive about the cattle kingdom is this concept of the open range. Now, the open range is an area where cattle ranchers can graze land for free. The government said there's all this open land because it wasn't all that populated in the West. There's all this open land. Send your cattle out there, have them eat out there, graze, get them fat, send them east so they can become meat, or in some cases serve other purposes. This is before we have cars and stuff like that, obviously. Um, and these cattle would take up a lot of land by grazing and stuff like that. A lot of inventions, a lot of pop culture inventions kind of come out of this era because of cattle ranching. One would be barbed wire. Barbed wire was used to keep cattle on somebody's land so they don't wander off. Blue jeans were invented during this time because it was made of a durable material that cattle ranchers could use when they worked. Now, one of the things that's kind of a myth about the concept of working in the cattle kingdom and doing all this is, of course, the concept of the cowboy, which we'll get into more in the next video. But working on ranches and working as a cowboy became a really popular job for former slaves. It wasn't a job that required a lot of skill. It could be earned quickly, and largely they're jobs that white people really don't want. As glamorous as the myth of the cowboy is, it really wasn't all that glamorous a job. Cowboys would go on these long drives, they were called. I'll show you a map here. We'll get back to that last point here in a second. They would go on these long drives where they would take cattle from ranches in Texas or other places, other stops along the way. They would move north to a big railroad hub where they would send the cattle east to be processed into food or whatever. This was an arduous job. This was a job that sometimes took months to do. So really, it was a job that wore you out. Cowboys would do one long cattle drive in many cases and then quit because of just the just the difficulty of that sort of work. But there were many popular trails. The most notable one was the Chisholm Trail that started in San Antonio, Texas, and ended in a place called Abilene, Kansas. You hop on a railroad, go to St. Louis or Chicago, meatpacking plants. Even Cincinnati had meatpacking plants. You'd go there, you'd process the food, and there you have it. Ultimately, like I said previously, the cattle kingdom goes into decline, just like many other things. Too many people got into it. Lands, that open range concept, it becomes kind of overgrazed, and ultimately, better options for beef are developed, and the viability of the Texas Longhorn kind of slips away. But its importance, just like the mining, just like mining, ranching does one really important thing. It gets people to move out west. It gets us to populate these areas, turn them into states, make us a nation from sea to shining sea. All right. So the other thing I want to talk about today is the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay. The Transcontinental Railroad is very important. It ties America together. It makes America one united place where somebody feasibly could travel from, say, Boston, Massachusetts to San Francisco, California by train. And it wasn't this journey that was going to take months, weeks, or whatever it might take. You could do it in a matter of days, and it's much safer. On the trains, you don't have to worry about the weather as much. You don't have to worry about Native American attacks or being robbed or things like that. So it provides an option to, again, be able to populate moving west. Okay, so the railroad is incredibly important for the future of this country, particularly the Transcontinental Railroad. It finally connected in 1869, May 1869, in Utah. They have this big ceremony. Ulysses S. Grant was president, so he's there. They have a golden spike, and they have the head of the guy that built the railroad goes in to drive the spike home, and he totally missed driving the railroad spike. All the workers laugh at him and everything, and but it's an important moment in our country's history because it links the country together from Pacific to Atlantic via railroad for the first time. And yet, build a railroad, there's going to be cities and stops and things along the way. The ability to populate regions more quickly. Okay, the railroad, as we've talked about a ton already, the railroad, in particular this one, the Transcontinental Railroad, are so important for the future of America. Now, I said a little bit before when we were talking about miners. Miners didn't just come from other places in America. They came from foreign countries. And one really popular place where miners came from was China. Now, unfortunately, when word finally made it to China that there was a gold rush in California, it's already like 1852, 53. So a lot of Chinese come on over to America to make their fortune, and everything's long gone. So there's few options available to Chinese immigrants. But one thing they do end up doing is working on building the Transcontinental Railroad. Why? Because they work really hard, you can pay them very little, and they're treated as expendable. The Chinese are smaller in stature, so they can fit into caves and crevices and things when you need to dynamite areas out, kind of like we did with the Irish when building the canals. The Chinese are the new version of the Irish. They're treated as second-class citizens. They're expendable. They would be killed in working on the railroads in avalanches or explosions and things like that. And no big deal in the eyes of the white American WASP workers who are there working to build the railroads. So why do the Chinese come here more and more and more? Life in China is not that great. In the 1850s, China is in the middle of a civil war called the Taiping Rebellion. Not something you're going to see on your AP exam. So a lot of people are looking for a way out, looking for a reason to leave China. And many of them take advantage of this by coming to the United States. So they're coming here for the same reason that Europeans came here centuries before, to seek a new life, to look for new opportunity, to try to build something for themselves here in America. And what they experience and what they find are the same thing that you would expect to see from any other native group that makes their way to America, any other foreign group that makes their way to America, a good degree of nativism. Now, if you don't remember what nativism is, that's favoritism towards native-born Americans. Well, Chinese don't speak English, they're not native-born, so at the end of the day, people don't like them. And we see a lot of anti-Chinese sentiments grow across the country, ultimately resulting in something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, something we're going to call super important point, AP point number 16. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a law that basically put a 10-year ban on Chinese immigrants from China. Okay, so for 10 years, no immigrants from China. Now, again, this is an act, it's a law, but it has to be enforced. Does that mean no Chinese people came in for 10 years? No, it was largely evaded in a lot of ways by people coming from China or American businessmen looking for cheap labor. But it's important in the sense that it reinforces ideas of white superiority and immigrant inferiority, which again we see time and time again in our country's history. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act stands out because it's the only time we've ever made a law in this country that completely excluded one particular race of people, one particular ethnicity of people from coming into the country. It's the only time where we ever targeted one group and said none are allowed to come in. What makes matters worse is it was a 10-year act in 1882. It was renewed basically in 1892, and in 1902 the Chinese Exclusion Act was made permanent. And it would exist really until the middle of the 20th century when those immigration restrictions were largely repealed. So again, it stands as the only time we've ever completely excluded immigrants from one particular country from coming into the United States at all. We've had limits, and many times in our country's history on like percentage based how many immigrants can come in, but we've never had one that completely excludes people of a particular ethnic background. Okay. Another thing that gets people to come out west is the Homestead Act. If you remember from Chapter 14, the Homestead Act was that 1864 act that promised people 160 acres of land if they agree to come out west, live there, and farm that land for 5 years. This actually works out really, really well. It's arguably one of, if not the most successful policy of the presidency of Abraham Lincoln in terms of how well it did. You know, we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation. It's more famous, but the Homestead Act is really important because more people come out west and try to make a life for themselves than was ever expected. So we get areas populated quickly. We're able to build up population quickly and get more states into the Union, get those numbers up for statehood more quickly. So the Homestead Act is really important in getting people to move out west here. And then our final point for today kind of talks about labor. Okay? What is unique about the West is you've got lots of people from a lot of different backgrounds. You've got former slaves. You've got whites, wealthy whites. You've got poor whites. You've got immigrants from Europe. You've got Chinese. You've got Mexicans. You've got a fair amount of women. So what the West develops into is America's first true multiracial working class, where you have people working together from a lot of different backgrounds, a real melting pot of people that use their unique skills and abilities that they have from their home countries or wherever to kind of create this the system of labor that really involves, you know, a lot of different types of groups of people. Where in the East, it's almost entirely European immigrants that are doing work. You know, you got Chinese and other Asian people coming over from the Pacific. You've got Mexicans coming from the South. You've got blacks coming from the American South that are former slaves looking for opportunity. And you have other folks that came from the East that just wanted to seek opportunity for themselves as well. So it creates this really unique and different working class in America that we really hadn't seen yet, and becomes a hallmark of the character of the country. So we're going to stop there. Again, went longer than I thought, but you know what I do. That's how it goes. So anyway, we will see you tomorrow, and that's it.